This video will describe the Relative Clause Structures tab of the Relative Clauses dialog. There are two tabs here. In this video we'll talk about the Relative Clause Structures tab. But first I'd like to provide a very brief review of relative clauses. In English we can say, I bought a book that John wrote. So here's a relative clause, that John wrote. It's modifying the head noun book. Book is the head noun. The word that is called a relativizer by linguists. And in English we use what's called the gap strategy. We don't repeat the head noun. We put a gap. I've written an X here. That's called NP-rel. NP-rel is embedded in the relative clause, and it has the same noun that's co-referential with the head noun. In our analysis, in the semantic representations, what you'll see is a noun phrase boundary, and then a noun, and it will have a noun list index value, which I'll show you in a minute. Then inside that noun phrase, you'll see a relative clause, John wrote, and we will repeat the noun in the analysis, and it will have the same noun list index value. Then you'll see the end of the relative clause boundary and the end of the noun phrase. For example, we're here at Genesis 11:1, sentence 1. This happens to be a title. It says, God causes the people who live at Babel to speak many languages. So here is the head noun, and the noun list index is set to 2, and it's in a noun phrase. Then embedded in this noun phrase is a relative clause. The relative clause boundaries are highlighted in red. There's the beginning, there's the end. Then inside this relative clause, there's a noun phrase. It's NP-rel. It's highlighted in purple. And here we see that the noun list index for this noun is also 2. Same as for the head noun. That's how our software knows which noun inside the relative clause is NP-rel. Coming back over here. Oh, by the way, it's very helpful when you're working with relative clauses to come here to Feature Adjustment Rules, Add New Features, and activate Option 6. This is a rule that will add a new feature to noun phrases called relativized, and the two values are yes and no. And that's the rule that will set the relativized feature to yes for NP-rel. So going back to our dialogue. When linguists look at the world's languages, not all languages employ relative clauses, but for those that do, they can be either embedded or adjoined. We'll talk about adjoined in a minute. If a language employs embedded relative clauses, they can be pre-nominal, post-nominal, or circumnominal. And I want to make one comment here before we go further. If you check pre-nominal, meaning your language positions the relative clauses before the noun, it's still up to your phrase structure rule for relative clauses to position the relative. It's up to your phrase structure rule for noun phrases to position the relative clause appropriately. For example, okay, this is for English. Here's the head noun. Down here is the relative clause. So it's your phrase structure rule that will position the constituents appropriately. Here in this dialog, these are just for information purposes. It's always your phrase structure rules that determines the final constituent order. So whether you check pre-nominal, post-nominal, circumnominal, it's up to your phrase structure rule for noun phrases to position the relative clause appropriately. If you check circumnominal, we need to know the head noun. So here's a rule that will insert a certain value in the head noun's surface realization feature. In one of our previous videos, I mentioned that we provide these 3 values. You need to provide these for your other pronouns. And then if you use circumnominal relative clauses, let's say head noun for circumnominal clauses. Now we can select that value in this drop-down. So now the head noun will have a surface realization feature of head noun for circumnominal clauses in the analysis. And you'll see that right here. If we rest the cursor there, surface realization equals head noun for circumnominal clauses. Now, the rules in your synthesizing grammar can provide the appropriate surface form, whether it's a special pronoun or maybe you need a relativizer or something. You can use that value in surface realization to write another rule that will provide the right morphology. Let's come back here. If we choose a joined, it can be either sentence initial or sentence final. I'll give you examples of those. Okay, joined relative clauses. In English we can say, I bought a book that John wrote. So the main sentence is, I bought a book. And there's also a subordinate relative clause modifying book that John wrote. If a language uses a joined sentence initial relative clauses, that means the relative clause has been moved out of the noun phrase. It's now either at the beginning or end of the sentence. If it's a joined sentence initial, then it will come first. John wrote a book, and the main clause, I bought it. There will be some trace here in the main clause. If the language uses a joined sentence final relative clauses, then we'll have the main clause first. I bought a book, John wrote it. And again, okay, now it will be up to your phrase structure rule for clauses that will position these relative clauses appropriately. If you use embedded relative clauses, so the relative clause is still embedded in the noun phrase, then it will be your noun phrase structure rule that's responsible for positioning the relative clause. If you use a joined relative clause, then it will be your clause phrase structure rule that will position the relative clause. If we choose these, let's choose these values. Let's put another value in here for a trace for restrictive relative clause. Let's go back to nouns, surface realization. Let's call it restrictive trace and descriptive trace. So for restrictive relative clauses, we'll have a trace, and for descriptive relative clauses, we'll have a different trace. And now we can select those values here. This is for restrictive relative clauses, so we'll select the restrictive trace. For descriptive relative clauses, we'll select the descriptive trace. And now, you'll see two things. First, the relative clause has been moved out of the noun phrase. It used to be in this noun phrase, but now it's been moved out. Now it will be up to your clause phrase structure rule to position this relative clause either at the beginning or end of the sentence. And now when we look here, the surface realization for the head noun has been set to restrictive trace. So now your rules in the synthesizing grammar can provide the trace for this head noun. You'll probably want that done somewhere in the pronoun rules, providing the proper surface form for the trace.